what this is going to be like. I'm really excited. Hello.
I'll wear the normally, but I don't want to wear the real one actually. That's dangerous.
Will you get interviewed by Jordan Peterson? Because then I'll be able to listen to you when I go to sleep. Or maybe Douglas Murray.
Great to you. I will actually, I can record my questions on TV and writing and go sleep to that. I don't know if you sleep well.
That's all right. So funny.
You dreamed like you listed with...
It's just, she's going to put the beep on so there won't be any voice. And it sound like an alarm.
You went back to the review. We can get rid of that menu view. See all of the heading 5 and everything like
Yeah,
that.
but where have you hidden all my open things? Or have you closed them?
They're all behind.
Where?
Oh, down.
Oh.
So see in here, you basically go view, full screen. That then just and then hit escape to get back out of that.
Oh no.
No, come on. Yeah, that's perfect.
No, but it's not what it like it was.
Okay, well you can go back to what it was.
Like it there.
That's fine. Except that the short people won't be able to see it now.
None of you need to join in with me.
But aren't you focusing on the Tereo anyway? So
Yeah.
but that's down low.
Yeah.
People might not be able to see
They're
that.
not going to have to see that because I'm going to say that and then we're all going to say the next bit.
Oh, this bit down here.
See, bold. Did you not go to an Anglican church as a
Oh,
child?
yeah.
Bold is
Wow.
for you.
Are you still in Times New Roman?
Is that Times New Roman?
What's
I'm
the
actually
difference
Jill
of-
Sands, but that's come
I
straight out.
actually, I like
Hey,
mine.
hey,
It's
don't
a
do
separate
that.
one.
The Anglican Church is part of colonialism. And
Yeah,
so
that's true.
they have
Sorry.
to use that.
That's appropriate.
He was going to pull a finger at me, but he thought he'd get it up.
But it's also easier to read.
It wouldn't be appropriate to be comic.
I welcome.
I-
I welcome.
It would be appropriate for our reruns to respond to the comic sense.
Common sense. No, I can't handle that. I like Jill Sands MT is what the church women use. Jill Sands.
You know what's really interesting about this though is that for a while we were using fonts that we did not legally own. And then college shifted to a font that basically relies on us retaining our Adobe licensing, because if we don't, we're not allowed to use those fonts.
Which is that font? Is it that Maria Pro?
Yeah.
Oh.
So, Jill Sands
Yeah,
MT, they did all these studies and it's the easiest to read in my
I'll
life.
just go to emoji font.
It cost me $5 per student per year for the full service, so it's pretty bloody cheap.
Can I have it on my phone? Because my phone won't work in Google Docs. I obviously shared something with it, but on my phone won't WTF.
Yeah.
What phone?
Yeah, we've got all the licensing for iPhones. All works
Because it's awesome on my phone. Because I'm not part of your, I'm not the Illuminati.
He could be. He just refuses to. There you go.
Yeah, we're not part of the Apple auction, mate.
No.
We're not part of the auction.
You need to go to
Great leap backwards.
well, this is a great start. Which one do we start?
My notes.
Okay, it's just like an Anglican church, but it turns up the last 30 years.
Citizen Jack Road.
Yeah.
And that's the three people.
I end up early enough to take out.
This is being considered, it's subject conservation.
Really?
And it would be diverse.
So are we gonna basically?
Well, it'd be pretty tough, really.
And it'd be going. This would be awesome.
So, how many more minutes have you popped up with the legal?
Yeah, and it's not down, we're not bringing it down, like,
You happy with that? As a main, well, neither do I. You're government.
Are you sitting in Anglican?
Oh, no.
Very good.
It's 5 times.
If I put my hair out, I would just like to have the same colour hair, so don't stop. Anything that'd be different about mine is I wouldn't just let the recent permit, it's not
And
permanent, so.
literally, the bulldozers are ordered on the back of trucks 3 times. How do you
Oh.
put that guy?
Oh, lady.
Old ladies go get that for these permit orders.
Interestingly, they go back to the old site now.
Yeah, that might be a mistake.
I think it makes us all look sort of more vibrant rather than like.
No,
It's completely different.
It's so seasonal because
It's not in the right guy.
you live in the stream of Isle. We see you on the stream of Isle. Cooper Calm. It's a little bit
Honestly, I think some days we're actually singing it. You know, like
That's right. That's how we go for the last bit. And the hat.
Yeah, when they arrive.
I'm sitting here, here we go. I'm sitting here.
You could be a leader here.
No, I'm fine.
Although somewhere in the front. I've also got a wireless lapel mic. Only because some of us are getting a little bit hard of hearing and don't want to admit it.
It's never been great.
So that's muted. That's currently muted. This is green. Orange is mute. So just literally just and then you can just speak. So you can pop that in whatever. Could give you a Madonna hit step. Yeah, check it out. We've got shotgun lights that will pick you up really sure. It's just connect. I will come up and do this. Yeah, like
So, is there
and over.
Thank you.
That's fine, I haven't got it turned off, so you're fine. I'll switch you back in a second.
Can you switch them on?
Yeah, I will.
Otherwise I'll muff it. We can do that while Caroline's talking. Caroline's been talking to this one. Yes. The front is a really good place to be.
What's he got? Oh, is it? Oh, this one, I know that.
I've only got
Kia ora e te whānau. Kia ora e te whānau. Is this going? We'll get underway. We'll get underway with the karakia. I'll ask you to join the page below with the Lord's Prayer and Te Reo Māori, and then we'll sing E Toru Ngā Mea. Ka inoi tātou, let us pray. E te atua tō mātou kaihanga. Ke te aho te maramatanga me te ora e o kupu korero. Ka tīmata au mahi. ka mau te tika me te aroha. Mea tia ki u tono ki a mātou, tō aroha I roto e tēnei hui hui ngā. Whakaaki a mātou, whakaro o mātou mahi katoa, I tu wairoa tāpu. Amene. Kua kona ne tātou e tō tātou ariki, ka ino e tātou, e tō mātou e te rangi, kia tāpō tō ingoa, kia tae mai tō rangatiratanga, kia mea te atau e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia rite anō ki tō te rangi, ho mai ki a mātou aia nei he taro mā mātou mō tēnei rā, muro mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei o te hongi e harana ki a mātou, o hoki mātou e kawea ki a whakoaia, engari whakorangi a mātou e te kino, no hoki te rangatiratanga, te kaha, me te karoria, ake, 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 amen. E tū whānau. E toru nā mea, nā mea nunui, e ki ana, te pai pera, tūmana ko, whakapono, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, kia ora te whānau.
Moderator staff, I would this morning, hello. I have the privilege of introducing Andrew Reiner, who is here from Towson University. Andrew has been heavily involved in the International Boys Schools Coalition. I have actually been part of some of the online programs that have been based around his work. And one of his most significant pieces that I know Garth has given to a number of us is Better Boys, Better Men, where Andrew discusses the new masculinity that creates greater courage and emotional resilience. Andrew is out here at the moment as part of the New Zealand Coalition of Boys Schools, and he's been up in Westlake.
Not yet, I'll be in Auckland next week.
Auckland next week, but he's here with us today and he's going to be running workshops with our Year 12s and Year 13s. He's also speaking at a combined event with Boys High, and there are a number of other, and speaking at Boys High, and then he heads north where he'll also be speaking up at Westlake Boys. It's a huge privilege to have you here today, especially in a very trying society and time where everything is very, very unsettled, especially for our young men. So I would like to ask everyone to warmly welcome him, and we look forward to hearing your insights this morning.
Thank you.
That's it? That's all?
Okay.
Good.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just going to grab some water. What's that?
Don't walk in front
Oh,
of
right, thank you.
Everybody will think that you've woken up.
Sorry guys, I just, my allergies are acting up with humidity, and I'm just afraid I'm going to go into a small coughing fit. Before I begin, I would be remiss if I didn't do something that I've always wanted to do when I do speaking tours and I travel. You know, a lot of times we go to concerts, you know, the band comes in, they know nothing about the city, and they'll just say something like, good evening, Auckland. So I think I'd be remiss if I just didn't say, good morning, Christchurch. So I just thought that's a good way to start. Just always wanted to do that. Excuse me. So today what I'm going to be talking about, excuse me, I'm starting up already. what I'm going to be talking about is really what my next book is about. And my next book is really kind of a springboard from where Better Boys, Better Men leaves off. My next book, which I actually just got the green light to do back in April, is going to be completely aligned with what I'm going to be talking about today. And what it's going to be is about the foundering that's going on for a lot of boys, and especially in Western cultures, OECD countries. This is going on, and you'll see as I talk a little bit more about what's going on for boys in the realm of education, but it goes beyond education. And this foundering is really affecting really all the most important parts of boys' lives. Education, mental health, well-being, their relationships. And what I'm really going to be focusing on today when I talk about these things is the lack of resiliency. The lack of resiliency that so many boys today are experiencing, and that we're seeing, so many of us are seeing, and the disconnect that results from that. I'm still trying to figure out, thank God it's in the early stages of the book, it's a chicken and egg thing. Is it some of the disconnect that's affecting the resiliency, or is it the resiliency that's affecting the disconnect? Regardless, I really do believe they're inextricably entwined. Absolutely. The more I research this, the more I talk to boys and young men, the more I'm convinced there is an inextricable entwinement, for lack of a better word, going on there. Of course, I'll be talking about the factors beneath this trend, and then I'll be finishing up as trying to give us some tips and suggestions about ways that we can try to engage boys in terms of connection as a way of increasing or enhancing their resiliency. So, my antenna was up when my first book was finished. I mean, think about it. You know, whenever we've done, we've done papers or we've done graduate level work, our antenna is up on that topic. Well, when you're working on a book for years, that antenna is going to be up for a long time. So that antenna was up, and one of the things I started realizing at the tail end of writing Better Boys, Better Men was that a lot of these boys and young men, especially that I was talking to and interviewing, really seemed to be off kilter. They really seemed to be lacking direction. They did not seem to have an inner compass. And I see this time and time and time again with the young women that I work with. And let me just say this at the outset, because I think in this day and age it's important to really make this distinction. When during the course of the talk that I'll say things about this is happening for males versus this is happening for females, that in no way is any kind of critique or criticism. It's not. What it is just to show that girls and young women are doing extremely well. They are doing a great job, as well they should, because they're finally getting the support that they've needed for decades, much more than that. But they're doing much better, which is fantastic. We want that for girls and women. But it's important to sometimes show the disparity in things by juxtaposing the two. So that's where that's going to be coming from. So I've given boys, especially this kind of wellness survey that I created about the areas that I was seeing there seemed to be some deficit for them. And some of the most common responses that I found, in terms of patterns, were that a lot of the boys and the young men were saying that they were down, but the most common responses were that they were very anxious and they were very stressed. And for my money, if that alone wasn't important enough, this was. One of the options that they had was, when I feel, in terms of the stress and anxiety, I need to ask for help. I'm doing okay with it, or I really could use the help, but I'm going to kind of push through. That was the response most often that they said. Extremely stressed, extremely anxious, but I'm going to try. I think I can handle this, and I'm just going to push through. And I will be talking a little bit later about this idea of independence, because we all want that for boys and young men, clearly. We all want them to be accountable. We want them to be independent, because that is something a lot of us worry about. Those of us who are parents and those of us, obviously, who are educators. So there was that. And there was also an area where I had them have a list of things to check off to see, I couldn't really think of any other way to word this other than just being completely direct, so they understood what I was asking, which is, do you ever feel disconnected? Do you ever feel really disjointed from the university, from the culture at the university, from friends, from family, and from yourself? The most common responses for the ones that were feeling disconnected were disconnect from the culture of the university, disconnect from themselves. That, of course, was a red light right there. Research is bearing this out. Research is absolutely bearing this out, because what some studies are finally starting to show is what some of us who've been paying attention to these things have started to realize all along. And thankfully, the research is now kind of filling in that vacuum. Because some of the studies that I've come across in the past year or two since I've started really leaning into this is that one study has shown that although freshman year especially, with the transition of university, which isn't surprising that there's going to be a struggle, right, with that transition. Although young men and young women both struggle, of course, what happens when they are alerted to their struggles by a professor, by an advisor, by an administrator, what often happens is that the young women will heed the warning. They will do whatever they need. They will talk to the professor. They will do whatever they need to catch up and to get back on par with where they want to be. There's another thing that they do that was extremely important, and it may not sound like it initially. They would also turn to their emotional support network, what I call an emotional safety net. And I'll talk about why that's so important in just a moment. The boys and young men, a complete 180. When the young men were alerted to their academic probation or their problems, they, as the report said, imploded. They didn't do anything. They did not seek help. They attended classes less. They were getting assignments in less. And then the other thing that they didn't do, and you can probably see where I'm going with this, they did not seek out emotional support from friends the way that the young women did. Why is that important? That is hugely important because, number one, and this may not carry much weight, we really all are, whether we like to admit it or not, emotional beings. And one of the things that you may remember, if those of you majored in education when you were in university, is that people learn best when they feel emotional connection to the instructor, to the course material, to the assignment. Every semester, when I start out working with freshmen, I will say to them, I'll say it's really important, if you want to do well, whether it's in this class or any class, that you take down the wall that you sometimes put up. And of course, they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I'll say to them, raise your hand if when you have done poorly on an exam or a paper when you were in high school, if it was because you disliked the teacher, you disliked the course, you disliked the assignment. Always their hands go up. Raise your hand if when you did really well, it's because the same thing. And they raise their hands. That's what we're talking about. It's emotional connection. We don't like to think of it that way because we don't like to think that our emotions are going to get in the way of our learning process or success. It does. We can try to cordon that off as much as we like, but really it gets in the way. Or I should say it really, if anything, really helps and supports. And that's really a large part of what's going on here, is that for a lot of boys and young men, what happens is when they're called out, they struggle to really feel like they can get back on track because they feel disconnected. When I was doing research for the book, there was a gentleman I spoke with, and I can't remember his name, he's a Dutchman, and he was doing work in California in prisons, and he started this amazing system for working with inmates in American prisons and teaching a lot of the things about emotional intelligence, things that most of them never knew anything about. Excuse me, one of the things he said to me was that, and I thought this was brilliant, he said there is a Native American tribe called the Sioux. And he said the Lakota Sioux have this term, and I don't remember what the term was, but it's a term that they have for somebody who is a criminal. And what it translates to is he who is disconnected from the tribe. That says it all right there. That is what happens so often with boys and young men. When they start to feel like they're falling or they're failing, they disconnect. That is exactly what this study is bearing out. And that is one of the things that I asked them to check off on the survey. When you get a bad grade, do you ever feel like suddenly the bottom drops out? This is more or less what I asked. I'm kind of elaborating on it. And that was another thing many of them checked off. When they receive one bad grade, not a bad grade for a course, a bad grade for an assignment, they feel as if they're completely just, everything is imploding. This is what we're talking about. This is the way that a lot of boys respond. Now, we don't see this in schools like Christ College for the obvious reason. There are parents at home. There are parents who often are paying a lot of money to be in schools like this. And even if they're not paying a lot of money, they're completely behind the educational process. So we know that that's not going to happen. But it does happen when a lot of them go off to university. And it does happen for many boys outside of schools like this. So the other thing is that one of the study said at the end, and I thought this was so important, they used the term emotional resiliency. They said that what it seems to be is that these young men are lacking emotional resiliency. And so here in New Zealand, here are just some examples of the disparity that happens at the university level. And again, as I say at the very bottom, in no way is this any kind of criticism of women, because in many, many ways they are doing so much so right. But you can see the disparity there in terms of being enrolled at the university level, male versus female. And then you see beneath that the Tertiary Education Commission for New Zealand, that percentage, the disparity with earning the degrees. In America, the ratio of males versus females, identifying as males versus females, who start out at the university level and stay initially at the college level, is between 65 and 70 female to 30 to 35 male, and that's across the board. That's across the board. It's a little bit higher in two-year schools, which we call community colleges. It's a little bit higher. In other words, there's a little bit greater parity, interestingly. But when you get to the four-year schools, that's when the disparity becomes much more glaring. And this I feel just deserves its own panel. This American College Health Association survey, which of course canvassed thousands of students who were willing to take part in it, and this to me was the most glaring thing that I saw from this study, was that 43% of the male respondents felt that just navigating their education at the university level was one of the most difficult and traumatizing things that they experience. So this goes beyond the university level. It happens at the graduate level, and it even happens in the workplace too. So we see at the top the ratio, and this is in New Zealand, by the way, in terms of master's degrees and doctorate degrees. In the States, the disparity is even greater. But I didn't want to keep going back and forth between the two because we're in New Zealand, right? But the disparity is even greater in the States for graduate degrees. So what's happening, that second panel I thought was really important because it's a trend that I think we're going to start to see more of, especially by economic and labor departments that are studying employment. Because one of the things that they're starting to show is that there is a growing disparity that's really kind of in its early stages now between males and females with employment with university degrees. This is not for people who leave after high school. This is for people with university degrees. And you can see in that second panel the disparities that happen for males and females with college degrees 1 year out of college, and that percentage difference stays the same 10 years later in terms of being unemployed. This was something, the bottom panel was something I wasn't surprised to see at all, which was a study that showed that women are 10% more productive in the workplace. Many of you who are women will not be surprised to hear that because of this, you are given much more work in the workplace. Shocker, right? So I think it's important to work backwards too, because for those of us, I know that's not the case so much here, but some of us have younger children, and you're an educator, so you know that we need to keep an eye on what's going on for younger kids as well, because a lot of it doesn't change necessarily as they get older. And so this, I thought, really put it in perspective. Because one of the things often I'll do is, I'll try to give sometimes some studies to bear a point out, obviously. But when you can get something that's happening on a more global scale, it really shows in stark relief what's going on. And I think that really shows it here. And that's coming from a fairly recent UNESCO report, which is that, as it says, males are much more likely when they're younger and in school to fall behind than girls and young women are. And as that spokesperson from the CEI said, it's great and it's really important that girls and young women are getting access to the education that they need and they deserve, that they rightfully deserve, of course. That said, we are seeing boys, as I like to call it, and I don't think it's hyperbole, we are seeing them starting to fall through the cracks in many different ways. So I want to talk a little bit about some other ways that we see boys struggling beyond the classroom, because of course it will also infiltrate indirectly into their disconnect or connect in the classroom. So it won't be surprising to hear that males of all ages are far likely to have issues with chronic alcohol use. What you may not know, however, and I don't know that this is necessarily true in New Zealand, but in the States it's true, which is that the highest rate of binge drinking between year 12, 13, and university is not males, believe it or not, it's females. It's females, right? You guys know about the wine mom, that whole kind of thing, right? This is the training ground for that. So it's a problem. This is a problem for young women because what a lot of, and I don't want to go too far afield on this, but what a lot of pandemic and post-pandemic research is showing that a lot of women increasingly are having major health issues, younger women in their 30s and 40s, because the way that men and women metabolize alcohol, just as is the case with marijuana, is different. And women are much more likely to have liver disease, which clearly is a huge problem. In terms of boys, boys with ADHD, not surprisingly, are more likely to experience and have issues with abuse problems. And that probably is not a surprise to many of us, for a lot of the obvious reasons. Because for those of you, if you're like me, if you have ADHD, you know how calming and focused you can be when that level of anxiety and all that kind of brain craziness really can calm down. So it's really not surprising. It really is common sense that this happens. Because really it's a form of self-medication. That's what it is. It's a form of self-medication. Marijuana is on the uptick. Marijuana is absolutely going, and that's very much a Western thing. It's not just in a place like the States. It's becoming much more common amongst younger people. And again, to me, this is not a surprise either, because of the stress levels that everybody who's younger has today, regardless of their gender identity. Everybody has through the roof stress levels, and that's an important other conversation is why. Because sometimes people like to say, well, isn't it just different? I mean, it's not really different. Because really, we just have more research today to bear it out, so it just looks worse. But there are a lot of factors, and I always love having this conversation, there are factors that we can point to statistically that show that there really are differences, and there are cultural differences that fuel that. Excuse me. For boys, what often happens, and this does not happen nearly as much for females, is that when they're using marijuana a lot, and this is true for younger men, older boys, younger men, they will experience more problems in school. They will also be more disconnected within their family relationships. And sadly, it also can lead to more suicidal thoughts, and that part of it is more common for males as well. So I'm going to try to keep this one brief, but these are some more important spheres of struggles. With the pornography, it's not surprising to know how addictive it is for so many boys and young men. A lot of us know about this. One of the things that doesn't get mentioned in the conversation that I really think should is that everybody thinks, well, it's boys are doing this, and they're just becoming, a lot of boys are becoming more misogynistic because of the kind of porn that they're consuming. What's really important to understand isn't just the concern of what they're watching, but it's important to look at why. It's important to look at why. And I don't mean to get overtly sexual at all, but I think this is an important point. Because there is research that shows this. When males ejaculate, there is a lessening of anxiety, there is a lessening of stress, which means right off the bat, it's a more focused way of self-medicating than marijuana or alcohol. And it also can help temporary. This is all temporary. It's all very temporary. But because what happens is there is a physiological response, and it's very calming. And it's like oxytocin, right? It's like oxytocin when we're bonding with somebody else. There's that feeling of not euphoria, but it's a well-being feeling. With gaming, I think really one of the most important things to consider is we know a lot of boys game more than girls do. It's not that girls don't game, but so many boys game so much more excessively than girls do. And one of the important things to keep in mind is, again, not just that they're doing it, but the reasons why. And I feel like that so much of this gets lost in our conversation because so much of it really is this scathing criticism of boys. But boys are not inherently horrible people. What they are doing often is they are finding ways to cope with feelings and emotions that are bigger than them. And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, when males and females experience a romantic breakup, there's research which has shown for quite a while that males are more likely to feel greater degrees of rejection for longer periods of time than females. They both initially start out with the same emotional fallout from rejection. But the girls and women are able to move on more quickly. The boys and men, not so much. And if you're male and you've ever experienced this yourself or friends, you know what I'm talking about. I can't tell you throughout my 20s and 30s how many conversations I had with male friends where I was struggling with this and they were struggling with this. Because there is a disparity in terms of resiliency and how we deal with these things. Because we really don't get the support networks that we need for these. In terms of gaming, again, it's a form of coping. And it's a form of coping when it becomes addictive, because it becomes a form of escapism. And as this Brazilian study had showed, that when there is excessive gaming in boys and young men, often it is a way of trying to escape and not deal with the struggles. The problem is that it makes it harder to go back and deal with those struggles, right? That's the problem. Another thing that's important to think about that really hasn't been on the table too much is body dysmorphia and muscle dysmorphia. This is happening a lot. It's not at fever pitch, but it's getting really bad in the States. It is happening to some extent here in New Zealand. Sadly, this is one of those things that will get exported. Because what's happening is that a lot of boys and young men are seeing a type of body image that is really becoming pervasive in terms of feeling like this is what a successful or competent man has. This is what he looks like. And this is something that is all over all the media, different forms of media that they consume. There's this kind of monobod image. My wife gets so tired of watching TV with me because even when we watch like Netflix shows, you'll see these guys taking off their shirts constantly now, and they've got these washboard abs, these giant pecs, these big biceps. I'm like, oh my God, here we go again. Because it's the message it sends. The message this sends is something that boys are not sophisticated enough or don't have the context enough to say, I don't need to be this way. It's this kind of monobod physique that is very similar to what, unfortunately, girls and women have had to deal with for time immemorial that was represented by Barbie dolls, right? That physique that is not attainable and that is not healthy. But it's the same thing with boys and men. They have a very similar dynamic going on now where there's one physique that they all aspire to. And one of the problems with that is that a lot of boys, when they're younger, as young as 11 and 12, will start changing the way they eat. Because that is something they can control, right? Just like anorexia. It's something they can control about the way they look. They're not at that point yet developmentally where they can have the big muscles. But they can start to control the way they eat, so they can start to get that thinner torso. And then there have been some more studies coming out which show that by the time that a lot of boys and young men are in their late teens and early 20s and throughout their 20s, as many as 20 or 25% of them are exercising to the point of almost being an addiction. Working out, I should say, not exercising, working out to get that physique. And clearly, I mean, you're talking about between, that's almost a quarter of a lot of the boys and young men that they've gauged in these studies. What they call it in the States, what some psychologists are calling it, is bigorexia. Because it's a combination of the eating disorder and feeling this need to have this inflated look. So in the States, Halloween is a really big deal. Halloween is a really big deal, and it has been for a long time. And whenever I go out trick-or-treating with my wife and my child, my son who's 12 now, we see these little boys running around, 5, 6 years old, and yeah, exactly, superhero. But it's not just that they're superhero. It's not just that they're superheroes. They're walking around with these costumes that are literally pumped up with air. So they've got washboard abs, and they've got the superhero physique that we're talking about. This is the kind of thing that they're exposed to. And again, it starts so young before anybody's really paying close attention to this. So what is causing this? I mean, those are some of the things that are really kind of manifesting that show really what's happening for boys, the way that some of this resiliency and disconnect is occurring. But what about, how are they, what's causing a lot of this? For a lot of boys, school is boring. Not surprising to hear, right? There was a great study done that showed that for high school-aged American males and females, of course we identify as that, they both equally experienced boredom about school. And it was a high level too. I don't remember the exact, but it was in the 70 percentile. It was high. They both equally experienced the same degrees of boredom and negative feelings about school, because school's gotten so incredibly stressful. The difference, they kept their eyes on the prize, the young women. They did not lose sight of what they were after. They pushed through the boredom to keep getting the grades they wanted to get because they had that, what I call, horizon vision. That's where the drop-off is for the boys. It's boring, I'm not doing it. Or they keep putting it off, the procrastination. And this is something that actually, as a quick side note, occurred during the pandemic, where a lot of educators thought that a lot of boys and young men would be more engaged during Zoom class meetings. They'd be a lot more engaged because this is something they can relate to. Just the way that so many boys and young men will bond through gaming, they will do a better job of learning online. The girls and young women felt more discomfort with it because a lot of them did like being in the classroom. The girls and young women, same thing. Even though they struggled with the idea of the transition, they kept their eyes on the prize and they kept their grades up. The boys and young men didn't. The medium everybody thought was going to help did not make a difference for them. So a couple other things that I think are important to look at have to do a lot with YouTube and other forms of social media. Because again, the messages that so many boys are getting, just like with that kind of monobod physique, so many of the messages that they're getting really work against so much of what we're trying to teach them in terms of values. Because so much of it is about quick, easy success. It's making a lot of money. And all you've got to do is go on to Instagram or Snapchat, or you can go on to YouTube. Is a great place to see this. And you get lots of influencers who have that physique, and all they're ever talking about and showing is how successful they are. All the followers that they have. That's a huge one right there. Right? The nice clothes that they have, the nice car that they're driving, the really attractive girlfriend. So these are things that boys are seeing. And honestly, I mean, and this is true in most cultures. I think a lot of Western cultures, the sports heroes that a lot of boys have, with the exception of somebody like Kerwin, who's talking a lot about mental health, years after not being with the All Blacks anymore, a lot of athletes are not talking about that unless they struggle. But what they're still really not talking about, even though it's great that they're talking about mental health, absolutely, they're not talking about all of the sweat equity and the process that's required to reach that level of all those things that all these boys want. They think, I'll drop out of school, I'll make a lot of money. Last night when I was giving a talk over at Christ Church Boys for parents, and hopefully some of the parents from here came, it's one of the things I was talking about is that, and a parent, we were having this conversation afterwards that she was saying, my son wants to drop out of high school. He's a really smart boy. He wants to drop out, he's 16, and he wants to drop out because he wants to make a lot of money. I can't tell you how often I hear that back in the States. I hear that from my university students. University is a lot of money in the States. It's ridiculous. And why should I keep paying all this money? Because I'm not going to be guaranteed to get the job that I want. I want to make a lot of money. I see some of my friends who didn't go to university making some money. I'm just going to drop out and do that. And of course, it's a lot of it is smoke and mirrors. Because what they don't get is that process is important. And those of you who are coaches in sports know what I'm talking about. You can go onto chat boards for coaches and they bemoan this. That so many of their athletes are great about really playing hard and showing up for the big games. They do not want to work hard in practices. This happens in testing as well. So many boys and young men who are very smart do very well in standardized testing. But so many teachers bemoan the fact that they aren't doing the work in class. They're showing up for the big test. This is a lot of the same kind of mentality that they're seeing on social media. And then lastly for this thing, a lot of us, this isn't surprising, right? That there is a delay in the maturation of the male brain. What happens in utero for boys is that they're flooded with testosterone. And what testosterone does, thank you testosterone, is it delays the maturation of the right hemisphere of the brain. So that is something that nobody's any control over. Because as they're developing their sexual secondary characteristics, as the testosterone is helping to do that, it also delays the maturation of the brain. That's where it starts, and it happens again in puberty. And so there's nothing we can really do about that. But a couple of the areas it affects, number one, are going to be that horizon vision. It affects boys' ability to look beyond the moment. And it also makes them more reactive and have that kind of tunnel vision about things. So these are things that we all see in the classroom. These are things a lot of us are used to seeing. This is another trend that really doesn't get talked about, and it's something I hope will as time goes on. For a lot of boys, school, not so much obviously a school like this, but for a lot of boys in more co-ed settings and at universities, I hear this all the time, school can feel like an unwelcoming place. And it's important that I give you a caveat here because I know some of you are probably thinking like, oh God, is this going to be some kind of toxic male thing? It's not. Because recently I was doing some research for an op-ed that I was working on. And one of the things I came across was a study which showed that in vitro fertilization, IVF, which of course couples use so that they can conceive a child when they worry about passing on some kind of genetic abnormalities. Well, that's what it's used for most of the time, right? In the States, that's the only country where you can do this, and people do it, where they will do it to determine the sex of the infant. What this study showed was that 70% of the time, 70% of the time, young white couples, 70% of the time, did it to try to conceive a female. In an article, and I should add, regardless of race, all these young couples in America that also were doing it, that weren't necessarily white, 30% of them were doing it and paying an additional $16,000 to have a female embryo. In an article that talked about this, there was a great quote from a woman who works in human resources, of all things. I thought that was really ironic. But she said, she was quoted as to why she's doing it, to have a female, to have a girl. And what she said was, and this was clearly, this was almost hyperbole, but she said, the idea of having a boy completely repulses me. I mean, that was the quote in the article. Another woman was quoted as saying, the problem with having a boy, the reason I want to have a girl, is because boys aren't they're not as family friendly. They don't have the connections, and I won't be able to have the kind of connection with a son that I would with a daughter. And that's one that I saw a lot on chat boards. Because there's also something some of you may have heard of called gender disappointment. And gender disappointment, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of this kind of trend that happens a lot on the internet. And there's a lot of conversation about, fears and reasons why a lot of parents don't want to have a child of a certain sex when they're born. An Australian psychologist who deals neonatal, prenatal patients did a survey about this, and she found that most of the gender disappointment complaining that went on online was from women, and it was about having a boy. And there were also a lot of their partners and husbands, males, who felt the same way. So it wasn't just exclusively the women, a lot of the men were on board with this too. And of course, we know a lot about the conversation that happens online about toxic masculinity. And look, if you read anything I've written, you would know that I am all for, holding men to the standard we need to hold them to. Boys as well, absolutely. All my writing completely speaks to that. That said, there also needs to be greater context. Because one of the things that happens, I don't know how bad it is here, but I know in the States, when it comes to a lot of social media and articles, there is a lot of bashing that does go on. And there is a lot of posting about all men being sexual predators, all boys being potential rapists. And that's very pervasive in the States. Mental health is another thing for boys. And I know I'm going to have to kind of go a little quickly on this one. So I'll just kind of go through it really quickly and say this. One of the problems with boys and men is that there's a lot of missed and underdiagnosed anxiety and depression. A lot. And again, that's a Western thing. Because up until a couple years ago, the DSM, which is the Bible for mental health care practitioners, did not include, when gauging depression, the symptoms that manifest typically in males. A lot of the mental health care practitioners were still using the symptoms that they thought were universal. Things like melancholy, lethargy, ennui, lack of appetite, maybe struggling a little bit with sleep. Some males do experience that, but that's not the most common. The most common symptoms for males with depression are reactivity, hostility, getting into more fights, blowing up much more quickly, leaning more into alcohol use, marijuana use, other kinds of drug use, risky behavior. These are the things that were much more common. And these are the kinds of behaviors that a lot of parents see, and they think, well, this is just my son going through his phase, just like my daughter, just like girls do. But there's a pattern here. It's one thing that boys, of course, can get a little bit explosive, right? And we have to learn how to help them reel it in. But when we see a change and there's a pattern that is ongoing, that might be depression. And there have been 2 studies over the past 5 or 6 years that have shown that when practitioners use these symptoms for depression that are more common to males, the parity is much greater between the experiences of depression for male and female. Practitioners, all research still bears out that women are much more likely to experience higher levels of anxiety. Girls, of course, too. But there is much greater anxiety out there for boys and men. Yesterday, when I was at Christ Church, I did this. I may do a version of it here. I did this activity with the young men, with the boys, and one of the things that they did was they wrote down on this mask some of the things that they don't show the world about themselves. And I constantly was seeing stressed and nervous, and that's not a coincidence, and that did not surprise me. There are a lot of men walking around, boys and men, who are a lot more anxious than we realize. And a lot of it goes undetected. And of course, a lot of us have heard, sadly, about the rates of suicide in that wheelhouse of age 15 to 24. And this is true, I know it's true in Australia, I think it was Australia as well. 3 times more likely in that age range, which of course is high school and university. And I want to talk really quickly about what I mentioned earlier about the ways that we teach independence. We all want boys to be more independent. We want them to be more accountable, and we absolutely should. Of course we should. Absolutely. The problem for a lot of boys is that when they hear the word independence, they think they need to handle everything on their own. That was another thing that a lot of the young men checked off in the survey. That was probably the thing that almost exclusively got checked off the most. When I have problems, I need to handle them on my own. They all checked that one off. They all checked that one off. That was, I think, was probably close to 100% for that one. A lot of boys and young men believe, part of it might be the brain maturation, and in males, brain maturation does not happen in the early 20s. It happens we thought it also happened in the mid-20s. A lot of research now shows it happens in the late 20s and early 30s. So the brain maturation is happening later. And so for a lot of boys and young men with that very concrete thinking, it's an all or nothing proposition. It's the idea that if I'm going to handle things, I've got to do it on my own. So there were a couple boys who spoke to this when I interviewed them for my book. One of them was George. He was in year 12 at the time that I interviewed him, which for us would have been 11th grade. And he, the previous summer, was struggling a lot. He either was having suicidal thoughts or he attempted suicide because one of the two happened for him. And understandably, he didn't want to share too much, which of course I respected. But a girlfriend had broken up with him, his first girlfriend. He was completely heartbroken. And things got really ugly for him. And I said to him, well, did you talk to your parents about this? And he said, no. And I said, did you talk to anybody? He said, yeah, I talked to a friend. We can see the problem here, right? So I said, well, George, if you don't mind me asking, and just, answer this if you're okay with it, why didn't you talk to your parents? And he said, no, I'm okay with answering. And he said, they've always told me, since I've been in high school, you've got to learn to handle things on your own. There was no gray area with that. There was no context. This was very much a concretized way of seeing this notion of independence. And I'll give you another example of this. There's a young man at the university where I teach who I had last semester, a really bright young man named Aryan. And Aryan was doing well. And he was, like a lot of boys and young men, right out of the gates was doing very well, with attendance, with getting assignments in. His assignments were very strong. And he just kind of, as often happens, just kind of started disappearing and not showing up and not getting in touch with me and not handing in assignments. And so I emailed him a bunch of times. After about 3 emails, he finally got back to me over the course of a couple weeks. And he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, absolutely, let's make this happen. So he came into class after, it was close to 3 weeks. And he came into class and we talked afterwards and he shared with me that he was struggling with what he was starting to realize was pretty bad depression. And he couldn't really get up to go to most of his classes. And I said, well, I'm not trying to pry, but I hope you're getting some help for this. And I hope that and he said, not really. I said, well, I hope at the very least you're just at least sharing this with your parents so they can figure out what's best for you. And he said, no, I can't tell my parents. And I said, why not? He said, because they're going to tell me that this is something I've got to handle on my own, and I'm probably making a bigger deal about this than it really is. So there were those two things. But I have just legions of stories of boys who have this notion that if they're going to be competent as men, they've got to handle it on their own. And that is probably the one vestige, and I write about this, bless you, in my book. That is probably the one vestige of kind of traditional, maybe even hypermasculine behavior that all boys have. Even those who don't subscribe to a lot of kind of more traditional, some extreme, even hypermasculine behaviors, they all follow that notion that in order to be successful and competent as ascending men, they need to handle everything on their own. And it's a sign of failure if you have to ask for help. So I want to share with you some words from a couple of the students that I had interviewed at the high school level who spoke to some of these things.
Sometimes, even if you're not feeling bad, sometimes you just need to vent to someone because all that balled up stress, anger, anxiety, it needs to go somewhere. It can't just be held in. So if you talk to people about it, I feel like they'll be very beneficial for that person and also for the advisor to take in that information.
Now that you're in high school, do you see a lot of guys doing that a lot of the things they struggle with, they just kind of keep to themselves?
Mm-hmm. And I even do that sometimes. It's not a good thing, but...
So when you do that, thank you for sharing that. So when you do it, Paul, why are you doing it? Why are you keeping it to yourself?
So I kind of just don't like telling my parents about my struggles, like with my grades. I kind of feel like I'm letting them down because like they expect me to, be getting all these good grades and stuff. And I feel like telling them it's hard to do that is kind of like, not meeting their expectations.
Does that get hard, feeling like you got to keep it to yourself?
Yeah, it does. And kind of just feeling like you need to tell someone but not knowing who.
Yeah. And does that make you sometimes feel like you're the only one going through this kind of stuff and you're all alone?
It does, yeah, definitely. And then, like, you see all these people that are, like, really successful and they don't really talk about their lows, just their highs.
So how does that make you feel when that's the message that you're seeing?
It's kind of like you're not reaching a mark that they have of, like, not having any lows. They just keep going up, and then you're going up and down.
So this is really what is so common.
Sometimes.
This is what is so common for so many boys and men. And this is not in the extreme either. It's this idea that I really should be doing it on my own. And what's part and parcel to that too is that feeling of alienation. It's happening to me, but it's not happening to everybody else. I'm alone in this. And that's an important thing that almost all boys experience. I think really this speaks for itself. And this Equimundo State of American Men survey really I thought was so important. That 2/3 of the men within 18 to 23 said that they feel like no one really knows me. And that's just not a throwaway line. Okay, that is not some throwaway line. What really underpins that, the subtext of that, is that whether they realize that they're removing themselves or not isn't really the point. It's that they feel that they're misunderstood. We're not talking rebel without a cause here. What we're talking is this feeling of things are not working out for them and they're pulling back, which means, and it's a very much a move that a lot of boys and young men don't realize they're doing, but they're self-isolating. Of course they can't be known because they're pulling away when they experience struggle and lack of success. And then of course there's that Australian Institute Health and Welfare study which found that about the social isolation and loneliness being so common for so many boys and young men. So this is the last part that I want to play for you before I quickly go over a few suggestions of ways that we can help boys.
I know that a lot of guys are relatively scared to talk about their feelings, especially in the room full of other guys, because they want to seem tough. They want to seem like, oh, everything's okay, I can manage, I can do this. But there's also a point where you can't manage it anymore. You need help. You need that helping hand to help you with other things.
Going back to like 6th grade, I would receive a lot of help from like my mom, my dad on like science, history, pretty much everything. So they would be like guiding me through it, telling me how to write good essays and stuff. And then like gradually over the years, I've noticed that that's kind of gone away. So now it's like I do my own work. And then I feel like since I'm doing my own work, I shouldn't be talking to them if I need help. Sometimes I'll go to my friends, but like sometimes they can't always give the help that I need. I always feel like kind of clammy talking to my parents about that.
Yep. That sums it up so well what Paul just said right there. And that's a very universal response. I just hear time and time again. With the boys I was working with yesterday, I heard similar versions of that. I'll go to a friend, but I won't go to my parents. So how can we help boys? Becoming more resilient and becoming more connected. I'm glad you asked. That is the great Kristen Wiig, who is an amazing comedian from the show Saturday Night Live. A couple of the things I'm going to throw out, I'll just kind of say this very quickly. Nothing I'm going to throw out in terms of suggestions of ways that we can help boys, none of this is too big of a reach. Nothing I'm going to suggest, I promise you, is something that only a counselor should really be handling. These are all really small, bite-sized things that we can metabolize that we can all do at varying degrees of comfort level. So nothing, I promise you, is going to be too much of a stretch. One of the things that we can do, and Julius talks about this. Julius is one of the boys that you just heard, and there's another slide which I probably won't have time to play where he talks about how great it would be to have morning check-ins. Not something that takes a lot of time, as he says, which I think was spot on, but just asking boys as they're coming in, how are you doing today? Making sure everybody is covered. That sounds like a small thing. And a lot of us might think, well, what's the point? If they're all just going to say, I'm okay anyway, right? They're all going to say that. That's not the point. The point, whether we realize it or not, is that when boys know that we are watching and we're showing interest in them, even in that really small way, they feel more connected. Because even though at that moment they're just kind of giving us the old, oh, I'm doing fine, thanks, and they're just going to move on and talk to their friends. When we extend ourselves, even in that small way, they feel more connected, right? I'll give you an example. Imagine that you're in the grocery store, right? And you knock over a giant thing of oranges, you're completely embarrassed, right? Somebody runs over and starts helping you pick them up without you even asking. How does that feel? That feels great. Some complete stranger has my back out in public. There is not a single human alive, unless you've got some kind of pathological problem, that would not feel good about somebody doing something for you, even if you don't ask for the help. You may not even want the help, but it still feels good biologically inside of our bodies. The dopamine levels go up. This is the same thing that happens to boys. They may not want or ask for the help, but I can tell you right now that it feels good to them to know there's an adult in the room and in this school that cares about them. Because believe it or not, these little things can lead to open doors later on when they do feel like maybe they're ready to talk to somebody. Because this little kind of thing really can make a difference. Showing up with words during the day. And I'll definitely conflate this one. But one of the things that a lot of schools are starting to do now, especially in boys' schools, are these kinds of going around at the very beginning of class. A lot of times schools think, oh, well, we'll do it in pastoral. Because, they meet once a week and we can just do all this kind of social emotional stuff then. You can do it in a small amount of time, and you do not have to. It doesn't require some big ordeal. It's just going around the room and saying, all right, before we get started, guys, Rose and Thorn, how you doing today? And just, what's one thing that's going pretty well? What's one thing, Thorn, that maybe you're struggling with or there's not going so well? That is something that most boys don't have. Most boys don't have that. Most boys do not have a place where they can go and talk about the great things that are happening. That is important too. And the not so great things that they're struggling with. That creates a support network whether they realize it or not. And there's power in bearing witness, as a lot of us know. The idea of just knowing that other people are sitting there, not responding, not judging, not offering advice or solutions, there is power in that kind of support. So something as simple as that, and again, that is something that can that can show that you really do care about them, because you're creating a space to care about them as people at the very beginning of a class for a few minutes. And I'll just move down the list a little bit more. It's really important when boys get upset to not minimize how they feel, because showing emotions, as many of us know, is a really, really hot and dangerous thing for a lot of boys and young men. They don't want to show these things. They don't feel that it's safe to do that. And when we say something like, okay, just, dial it back, or come on, don't get so worked up about it, something that is so common to say, the message that sends to a boy who already feels shame about these kind of things is, I really can't do this. And they feel even more shame for having done it, which means they're going to be even less likely to be able to access that again in other places, not just this one. So it's really important, at the very least, you don't have to do anything other than just, I see you're upset, I get it. That acknowledgement is enough for a lot of boys. If you want to show some empathy, wow, I saw what just happened to you in class today, what that boy said to you. Pull him aside. I know I'd feel the same way. I'd feel the same way if somebody said that to me in class too. I get it. That's it. Something as neutral as that kind of acknowledgement for boys teaches them that it's okay. It's okay to have the feelings they have, and that they too can be emotional beings. I think it's really important also, one of the things that I've started doing more when I teach is doing less right and wrong kind of curriculum and trying to leaven in questions. One of the great things about asking questions, we all know as academics, is that critical inquiry is so vital to learning and understanding. It is so vital. And God knows these kids need a lot of critical inquiry skills. But the other thing that it does is it neutralizes that fear of being wrong. So many boys and young men, when they get older in university, will not take part in conversations because they don't want to appear wrong. Believe it or not, it's just that simple. I hear my students say this all the time. I'll say to them on the side, why aren't you getting involved in discussions at all? And they'll say, I might say the wrong thing. I don't want to be judged. And so questions are a very neutral way of getting boys engaged because there is no right or wrong question. And then it's one of the things I think that a lot of schools sometimes miss. They do a great job of saying we're going to do community outreach, and that's an important it's an important component in a lot of schools, which is fantastic. But one of the things that's really important is that that also is an important place where boys can learn greater connectivity, where they can learn to feel more connected, and that's something I think would be really important for schools to do even inside of the school. Doing things, creating community, ways to build community inside of the school where boys can feel more connected. Clearly, I'm sure you do that, but I can't emphasize enough the idea of helping boys to understand that when they're doing things and they're extending themselves, that's a way that they can also feel more connected to other people and as they serve other people. And then lastly, touch. Now, I know that this isn't something that's for everybody, but one of the things that a lot of us do know is that sometimes when we can't use the words, we can't find the words, or we don't feel safe with the words, a small degree of touch can show a degree of connection and support. So, hugging is always great. If you're not a hugger, not a problem. Maybe you can just fist bump. Maybe you can just put your arm around a boy's shoulder. Another thing that a lot of boys are even more comfortable with is sitting next to them when they're struggling. Maybe asking him to stay after class, and instead of standing up and talking to him while he's sitting down, sitting next to him. That close proximity without any touch for a lot of boys feels more supportive than us standing up and talking to them, because there's that power differential. So, if there's anything that you take away today, it's hopefully this idea that, the more that we are showing up for boys and looking for small, simple ways that we can really increase that connection, the more we really are helping them to build their resiliency. Because that really is the taproot so much for not just learning, but for the relationships that they need for the rest of their lives. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Andrew, on behalf of the Christ College staff, I'd like to say thank you for sharing your insights. As a fiercely proud mother of a son and a daughter, I found it really affirming, but also quite shocking in terms of some of the things that you shared around the girls and the boys and their development and what they're experiencing in the world. For me, on a professional note, chasing the why has always been one of my fundamentals around when we're in the classroom, and it was when we actually understand what is driving behaviours and actions and emotions. It's really important. So if we could give Andrew another round of thanks, and then throughout the morning in working periods 3 and 4, 5 and 6 if you have any questions or you want to catch up with them.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Well, I hope it wasn't too
and he is very, very much. Thank you.
It's individualistic, absolutely. Yeah.
Thinking is something that's but in order to do that, it's a lot of hands-off.
One undermines the other. It really does.
I just found it so interesting, like the different dynamics. And I thought it'd be interesting to contrast maybe sort of
Then we engage. As soon as it gets to the point, we switch off.
like a lot of what you're talking about.
It's exactly what you and I.
A lot, yeah, and really, I think that that trend that we're seeing, that I was talking about, really, it is. There are degrees of it in different countries. It's actually, I think, in a lot of ways in the States, because of the kind of culture.